Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and in this episode of Fantasy Rearmed, we're going to be looking at the best weapons that a creature with 4 arms would want to use based on the advantages and disadvantages that this might bring. This is a very kind of interesting and complex creature type to look at. I can't pin down exactly a just broad, flat type of fantasy creature that is, considered a race that is commonly known, okay? I can think of examples like the creatures in John Carter of Mars. They got 4 arms. There are individual monstrous type, characters that have 4 arms. Isn't Goro from Mortal Kombat? So the idea of this creature type is at least prominent enough to appear in several different fictional kind of properties, and of course has appeared in fantasy, not generally as a flat, blank fantasy race, but certainly prominent enough for us to look at. And the interesting thing about this, it leads us to some sophisticated kind of discussions on the properties of combat and weapon types. So, perfect fodder for a good Fantasy Rearmed episode. So, like usual, we need to set forward some of the basic physical characteristics. And I don't think these creatures would inherently have greater strength than humans. In actual fact, I think it's more fair to just look at them with fairly standard humanoid characteristics. They could become particularly muscly. Like, I'm sure Goro is stronger than the average human, but that's through training and other things like that, and the other Mortal Kombat fighters get just as strong. So, look, within the range of what an average human could attain and stuff, we'll go with that. And the main distinct advantage or disadvantage are these 4 arms. And so there are a lot of different combinations to really explore, because there's a lot of different ones that come to mind, like could 2 shields, 4 swords, 2 two-handed swords, 2 shields, and 2 swords, 4 one-handed, did I say 4 one-handed swords? It's a lot, I'm getting confused. Okay, so we'll just have to go through one by one, pros and cons, and hopefully come to a weapon type set that would offer the most advantages for this type of creature. So a creature is capable of holding up to 4 shields. Well, that's pointless because he wouldn't have a weapon. And even if there's a situation where he would want to, you can actually just get a shield that's large enough, like a single shield, just one shield that's large enough to cover your whole body. And so if you can do that, why would you hold 4 smaller shields to give you enough protection? And if you want to hold 4 large shields, what's the point? Because 1 shield is enough to protect yourself. So I think we've kind of answered the question that even 2 shields would be a bit redundant here, because 1 shield is enough. You only ever need 1 shield. So if there's a situation where this creature needs a shield, 1 shield will do the job. A kite shield would definitely be his best pick. Now look, he could go with, a tower type shield like a scutum or something like that. So that would also do the job. And if he is on horseback and he needed a smaller shield to get more maneuverability, swinging it back and forth, stuff like that, well then actually a heater shield might be a good pick. And in that circumstance, 2 shields could be advantageous. They could work. Now, of course, you only need shields if you're not wearing enough armor to protect yourself properly, or you're facing opponents with weapons that can offend you while still wearing armor. So if they are wearing full armor, wouldn't really need a shield. So I should look at a situation where you might want a shield and you might not need a shield. We're back to 4 free weapons. What weapons would that be? So the first kind of thought is, what about 4 individual weapons, 4 swords, 4 maces, and you could mix them up with like a sword, a mace, a war hammer, and then something like a dagger or something in the other hand and stuff. And so this kind of really comes into the question of how much individual versatility or control the creature would have with these 4 individual arms. Would they get to a point where it's too awkward? Because there are some movements just with our 2 hands that can kind of muddle and befuddle us, like the tapping your hand and rubbing the belly kind of thing, right? You can obviously train yourself to do awkward, counterintuitive movements, but generally our hands seem to be fairly synced to work off one another quite well. And when we start to try and tell them to do specifically opposite movements, it can get awkward unless with specific training. And there's the fact that if this is a legitimate creature race, they might have a genetic encoding, just with their reflexes, to have higher coordination with technically 6 limbs, 2 legs, 4 arms. That enables them to use their arms in very complex counterintuitive movements separate to one another, kind of like an individual brain segment controlling each arm independently, but then also being aware how each one is moving so you don't get tangled and stuff like that. And in that circumstance, oh yeah, my goodness, 4 weapons would be crazy deadly.
Attack
Wow. Something that's interesting to point out, which brings us back to one of those more sophisticated discussions of weaponry combat and things like that, is the issue of length, okay? And that when a weapon gets too long, having more than one of them can actually become more awkward, okay? So the longest one-handed weapons that on a standard level, just the average, okay, is the rapier, okay? The rapier is basically one of the longest one-handed weapons in history, with the exception being the spear, but it depends, because a spear is not as effective if you're just using it in one hand and so on and so forth. But anyway, okay, so the rapier. Now, dual-wielding rapiers certainly was a thing that people tried out. There are pictures of manuals, in the treatises explaining how you can do it. But more often than not, in actual combat, when you wanted to dual-wield and you're already using a rapier, the dagger was the complementary weapon. Why is that? Well, there is the fact that having two really long weapons, they can get caught on one another and in the way. So say if you have the weapon out and you need to move this weapon down and the weapon is really long, well guess what? You're going to hit the arm or you're going to hit the tip of your sword, and so having something shorter actually gives you more maneuverability and options in where to put that weapon if you're already holding something that's particularly long. And so the rapier and dagger was a far more preferable combination than a rapier and rapier. Well, we can extend that logic to forearms. If we are going with weapons that are particularly long, well, there's even a higher chance that these weapons are going to hit one another and get tangled and such. Now, this would be less so with spears. Spears are going to be kind of interesting because you don't need to do sideways cuts. Spears are always thrusting, which means there's far less chance of them getting caught in the way, knocking against each other, than say with swords. And so, 4 spears, gosh, can you imagine fighting a creature with 4 spears thrusting at you in different angles, different heights? You're stuffed. How could you fight someone? You'd need a really big shield. I think that's one of the only things you could do effectively to protect yourself against a creature with 4 spears. Now, sometimes they're shown to be taller than humans, but if they're the same height as humans, okay, they could try and reach around and get the spear around your shield, and then, yeah, because if you went to block a shield that's trying to get it around, you have to block up, then you open, and it would be tough, gosh. All right, but going back to the swords, if you're going to be quadruple wielding swords, dual wielding, triple wielding, quadruple wielding swords, okay, you wouldn't want them too long, in my opinion, for the fact that they might get tangled in with one another. You could use one that's particularly long, but even that one that's long, as soon as you need to maneuver that sword in a direction where one of the other swords are in the way, they're going to hit. And so arming swords are about the furthest length I feel you would want. And look, this is all speculation. I don't have 4 arms. I can't exactly test this. So in my own logical estimation, I think arming sword would probably be as long as you'd want to go, but the shorter would be the easier and more convenient. And so shorter swords would be more effective. And it's funny, there are short swords, but then there are swords that are shorter than arming swords, but aren't necessarily considered short swords because they have a lot of punch, basically, like the falchion. The falchion is generally shorter than an arming sword, but my goodness, that cutting power on that thing, it's beastie, okay? Because when people generally consider short swords, they think of a sword that has less punch than an arming sword, but a falchion, that has easily as much more cutting power than a regular arming sword. And so if you still want a sword that was shorter, but still had a lot of bite to them, I think a falchion could be really, really good. Far worse than the thrust, and so you could then start to mix it up. What if this 4-armed creature dual-wielded 2 falchions, so maybe a falchion in each hand on the underhands, and then on the upper hands, 2 spears? Like, gosh. And then, oh my goodness, you got these 2 spears being thrusting at you. And one of the tactics with spear fighting, again, coming back to some of the complex, sophisticated things that we need to consider when looking at just general combat, is one of the ways to beat spears is to get inside the range. So if your opponent is using one spear and they thrust at you, if you can block that thrust, your sword then is pushing away, kind of warding off the opponent's spear. The spearhead is to the side. You can just rush inside their guard, essentially, and just hack them to pieces and they're gone. So that's one of the most effective ways to fight someone with a spear. But if they have a backup shorter range weapon, you run in and then you got other weapons to deal with. So it's more difficult to do this as a regular person because using a spear in one hand is far more awkward. And so if you were dual wielding a spear and short sword, it's difficult, you could do it, and it's a good way to protect yourself if someone closes the distance. So with this 2-handed creature, well, I mean, you got 2 falchions you're dealing with as soon as you try and close the distance. Not only that, if you had ward off, one of the spear attacks, you got another spear to deal with. these creatures would be pretty difficult to fight. And if a creature wanted more control over the spear, well, they could use one spear with their two side hands here, and then they could use a shorter range weapon. Now, when I say shorter range, there's a bit more complexity to this as well, because even a long sword, which is a sword that has a longer blade, can offend people in quite short range, because the blade, well, you can offend people on the whole length of the blade. So even if they move behind the tip of the sword, you have the blade near the handle that you can still strike with. So if this creature wanted more control and leverage in their striking, so therefore using a spear in two hands and then a two-handed longsword in the other, so there's a hand here and then a hand here. Am I getting off camera? So there's a hand here and a hand here holding a sword like this, but both hands would be of kind of like the same side, right? And then they would be double-handing a spear on this side. Even if the opponent closes the distance behind the spear point, they can still get this big chop on the head by this two-handed sword. I mean, there are a lot of combinations that would be pretty darn effective, but I am quite liking that two-handed spear and two-handed sword, even probably more so than the two spears and two falchion combo because of leverage and control. More often than not, I will prefer a long sword over dual-wielding swords, and I've tried the combination stuff in lots of different sparring situations. And look, admittedly, dual-wielding swords have some really big advantages. The thing is though, if you want to take in personal fitness into account, stuff like that, it takes a lot more energy to use two. It's like holding up the guard of a two-handed swords for an extended period of time takes far more energy than the standard guards of longswords. In the longswords, you can find a guard that's actually also a rest position, and so I can actually fight better for a longer period of time with a two-handed sword over dual wielding, even though to begin with, when I have full energy, I can use two swords far more effectively in offense than a single longsword. And so for the four-armed creature, well, they could hold their longsword in a rest guard position, like maybe down or something like there, and then have the spear also there, which means they would be able to fight very effectively for a longer period of time, because as soon as you go again to the, two falchion or two things, you're holding a single weapon with one hand, which takes longer, and if you get proper guard positions, you have to hold them up, so it'll fatigue you a lot quicker. So because of that, I'll say once again, I think the two-handed spear and two-handed sword is probably the better pick in my opinion so far. Now, if you wanted to add a shield into the mix, well, you could still get away with this. You could hold a spear with one hand, probably in the upper one, and the bottom hand on the left side, holding a big shield, protecting the whole body, and then a two-handed sword on the other side. In comparison to a regular human, as soon as you're using a shield, you only have one hand left to use your weapon. And using one-handed weapon against someone who has two hands on their sword, there's a big difference in leverage and reach, and so the advantages are quite striking. And a creature with four arms would be able to do that and employ a shield at the same time. A shield, a spear over top, and a two-handed sword on the side. It's kind of covering everything. Really long range. You can offend the opponent if they ever close the distance, get in behind the spearhead point with your big two-handed sword, just chop them up. And even if they're close range, because you can strike with the blade just above the crossguard, you don't need a shorter sword to be able to do that. Then you get the added advantage of leverage. And then you have the protection of the shield as well. My goodness, I think we might have found it. Spear, kite shield, two-handed sword. It covers most of the things. And if you are wearing armor, well, then you can use your spear with two hands, get more leverage and maneuverability and even greater speed with it, and then two-handed sword. The question now is, what if we throw those matches up against each other? A four-armed creature who is using two spears and two swords, so four weapons all up, against a creature that's using a two-handed spear and a two-handed sword. Well, I think the comparison is actually quite comparable to comparing just a regular person with two arms, dual wielding, fighting someone with a single sword. Generally, I give the advantage to the guy using two swords, but the guy using the two-handed sword, the long sword, has greater reach and has more leverage, can give heavier strikes, and generally is able to adopt better guard positions which are able to maintain his energy for longer. And so it becomes far more even in that comparison. So I can't really give the edge to either one in that situation, and I know which one I would prefer. I would prefer the two-handed grip because I like reach, I like leverage, and I like rested guard positions. So yeah, I would still go for two-handed spear, two-handed sword, if wearing armor, if not wearing heavy armor, shield, spear, two-handed sword. Now, of course, I have to mention ranged weapons because the bow has come up so many times in our Fantasy Rearmed episodes, and usually the bow is great. mainly because these creatures either have smaller kind of strength to weight ratio like the dwarfs, or they have greater strength like the orcs, or they have better kind of speed in narrowing in on the targets and for cultural elements like in regards to the elves, or they just don't want to get into melee fighting like smaller people. The bow has generally been a really good pick for most creatures. But in regards to using two bows, because they have 4 arms, so could they use 2 bows? Yes and no, all right? It depends on how they're held. If you're holding the bow on the side, okay, and you're drawing, as soon as you have another arm trying to hold a bow, one of these arms are going to get in the way of the string of the other bow, which makes it very impractical, and you wouldn't be able to hold your bow that way. The only way you could do it is you had your 2 upper arms holding the bow and kind of, pulling it back sideways, and then your bottom set of arms doing the exact same thing. As soon as you pull it onto the side, one of the arms is getting it in the way. The problem with pulling the string on the side of a bow like that is you can't do a full draw. A way to offset this is to just increase the draw weight of the bow, so you could probably only pull it back that far. Then it should have as much of a range, but still the power stroke, which is the length that the string passes before launching the arrow, would be shorter, so you'll run into the same problems and limitations that you have with kind of crossbows. So it's not necessarily to say that a higher power bow that you need to pull back for less distance would actually be able to shoot arrows at a longer distance as a bow that you could do a full draw and get a longer power stroke as a result. So again, I think there are limitations in doing 2 bows on the side like that. But what about a really big bow? So one arm holds the bow and then it's pulled back with 3 arms, or even 2 arms. What if these creatures got a particularly high-powered bow and they use 2 arms holding it on one side and 2 arms pulling back the string on the other? That should mean you technically should be able to double the pound weight of that bow, which should make the bow twice as powerful. Maybe 4-armed creatures are one of the only other creatures that could use orc bows really easily, because orcs have greater strength, so their bows would be thicker, stronger, and stuff like that. Yeah, 4 arms kind of does the job, because imagine you can pull the string back with 2 arms and pull a higher weight than as opposed to 1 arm. So yeah, 4-armed creature, either 2 arms or 3 arms pulling a string back. So in that instance, bows would be a really good pick. Once again, it's almost like every other fantasy creature is better with bows than humans are, except elves. I mean, look, go watch my video. Elves, there are certain circumstances in which elves get advantage, like seeing in the dark, but in terms of their ability to aim, I do still feel that humans technically have just as good ability to aim as elves do in regards to bows. But most of the other creatures, dwarves, orcs, giants, but still giants are better with slings, but still all better with bows than humans. That's the funny thing. In these fantasy rearmed episodes, we always come to the conclusion that humans are kind of stuffed in these fantasy universes. So quickly, let's try and think of some other weapons. Flails. No, you don't want to be wielding 4 flails. 3 times the chance of the flail spinning around, getting tangled with the other one and hitting yourself, so no, flails are not bad. I mean, heaps of other weapons would be useful depending on circumstances, because any situation where a sword is not a good pick, like if you're fighting someone in heavy armor, that 2-handed sword on the side, not a good pick. You'll then want to switch it in and out with other weapons depending on circumstance. So the shield and spear, I think, are great combinations on one side, but the other side, switch it up depending on who you're fighting. So if it's someone in armor, well then, yeah, get a big pole arm in the other set. Spear, shield, poleaxe. And again, depending on circumstances, switching it up. Maybe you want spear, shield, and 2-handed spear. Spear, shield, and 2 maces, all right? But I think that a spear is such a good, when I say it's versatile in the sense that it's effective in so many situations against so many people against armor. The weakness was always getting behind that spear shaft. But if you have another primary weapon that's a backup if they ever close the distance in the spear, well, you're never disadvantaged in having that spear to use its reach and all its great advantages all the time. So spear and shield, and the shield to protect you, and then if you don't need a shield because you're wearing armor, 2-handed spear, but always having a spear at least. If there's a situation where you could always use a spear and not be suffering from those weaknesses, you would always want to use a spear. And so I think the spear is always going to be a combination set to the weapons that this creature is using. So on average, that is the combo. Spear, shield, 2-handed sword, or any other weapon depending on circumstance. That's pretty cool. And these creatures, they would be tough to fight. Wow. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for watching, and until next time, hello.